Good evening, everyone. And welcome to the Library of Congress. So welcome to our Live at the Library night. Tonight is our Discovery Night or Science Night. I just want to emphasize the importance of science and the value of it, that it really opens everyone's imagination, lets us be explorers, and that's the purpose of this evening. As we created Discovery Night to honor the thrill of intellectual discovery and to show you the many ways the Library of Congress can be your home of intellectual revelations. In addition to this wonderful panel tonight, please head up to the second floor to our hands-on exhibit, where you can see some of the library's collection items and see the library's preservation department do their thing. Then you could go to our room called LJ113. Somebody up there will tell you how to get there to see more of the collection items. The library, of course, we're the largest library in the world with more than 181 million items. Includes, of course, the papers that you would expect that's here at the library, from George Washington to Thomas Jefferson to Rosa Parks to Sigmund Freud. But the library, as I mentioned, we're here to celebrate science and discovery, so we have the papers of Carl Sagan and Robert Oppenheimer. And if you go upstairs to see our new exhibit, The Two Georges, which features the papers of George Washington and King George III, if you know Hamilton, you know what I'm talking about here. You'll see that the two men who are very pivotal titans in history had things in common. One of them is science and agriculture, so I'm hoping that you could check that out when you go upstairs. As I mentioned, we have two panelists tonight. We were going to have three. Unfortunately, one of them is not feeling well. So tonight's featured panel is titled Follow Your Passion, and we have two incredible writers here to tell us how they did exactly that and ended up with the books on the history of discovery, about zombifying parasitic insects, and the hidden history of hyperpersuasion. Our writers tonight are Rebecca Lemov. She is a historian of science at Harvard University and has been a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute. She is the co-author of one book and the author of three, including The Instability of Truth, Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyperpersuasion. Our next author is Mindy Weisberger. She is a science writer and media producer and a science editor at Scholastic. She is the author of Rise of the Zombie Bugs, The Surprising Science of Parasitic Mind Control. As I mentioned, we were going to have a third author tonight, Carl Zimmer, but he can't join us tonight. We'll start off the evening that I'll be asking each one of them a couple questions, then we'll have a nice little panel discussion right afterwards. But before we get to that, some housekeeping. Make sure you silence your phones. If you're going to keep them on, I expect you to post pictures and tag the library on your social media. And also, if you want to buy their books, please buy them. They're by the information desk. Once you walked in the library, you probably saw it. Then we'll be having a book signing right after this evening's conversation. All right, Rebecca, let's start with you. Your new book is titled The Instability of Truth, Brainwashing, Mind Control, and Hyperpersuasion. And you've been thinking about brainwashing for a while now. It's not one of those things that people really think about all the time. What interested you in brainwashing?
Well, yeah, when I started researching this topic, it seemed like a very niche or maybe a little bit disreputable even word. The word brainwashing had gone out of favor. And in fact, when I proposed to my department in my first job that I teach a class on it, they said, like, why would anyone want to know about that? Or why would you do that? But luckily, they let me do it. And I think I got into the topic because I had been writing a dissertation about some questions about freedom and control in science and the kind of history of behaviorism, which seemed like sort of abstract questions about how much a laboratory animal could, be forced to run through a maze and under what conditions. So brainwashing seemed to pose the question more forcefully by looking at episodes in which people seem to have their minds changed against their will, but it really asked the question about how much people participate in that process.
Nowadays, you hear the term gaslighting. How do these all overlap?
Well, I think that, what I discovered it's been a couple of decades now, and I've seen people, the word brainwashing has gone from a word that seemed unserious or sort of maybe a remnant from the 1970s to something that seems deeply concerning and is often used as an insult. But what I try to do is look at the early Cold War and the experiences of POWs under re-education and thought reform and try to draw lessons or sort of perform a thought experiment and apply that to conditions that we all find very familiar. including things like gaslighting, which have entered, the language as a way of describing being in an informational environment that seems unstable or unreliable.
One of the most, I guess, infamous cases was Patty Hearst when she was kidnapped, and there was a lot of mind control when it came to her kidnapping. I'll get that.
Okay.
Oh, we lost the water. But
It's gone.
could you tell us more about Patty's story and how mind control factored into it?
Right, well, and so Patty Hearst was a young college student. She was 19 and she was living in Berkeley, California. She was identified by a leftist, this is just the short story, a leftist underground organization called the Symbionese Liberation Army, which targeted her because she was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst and she was seen as the heiress of a capitalist fortune. So they did what they called a righteous arrest of her, which meant kidnapping her from her apartment and putting her in the trunk of a car and holding her in a closet for 59 days, during which time she was subjected to, terrible conditions, not allowed to be alone or go to the bathroom by herself. She was read Maoist tracts and other books, and she was forced to make confessions and broadcasts which were sent by cassette to the local radio station. So over time, she seemed to have been changed, and by the end, she declared that she had chosen to stay and fight with this group, and she ended up robbing a bank with them, and
that infamous picture.
The infinite.
With a beret, so yeah.
Exactly. She was adorning, she kind of became a hero in a sense because she looked like she'd become this she called herself an urban guerrilla, and she was renamed as Tanya, but this somehow in the telling of the story, and in some ways because she was the only member of the group who was eventually prosecuted for that crime, it was sort of the part about the kidnapping and the rape she had undergone and the almost unimaginable conditions was erased out of her story. But when she went to trial, they brought the same experts who had been used during the Korean War to describe and understand the POW experience. These very same experts became her defense team. And unfortunately, the argument was unsuccessful in court, proving that brainwashing was not legally viable, but there was that other connection as well.
I know that was kind of very, was a big deal of using that as a defense.
Yeah.
Do you think that defense could have been a little bit better? I mean, just based on what you know about brainwashing that?
I think, yes, I would say, though I'm not a legal expert per se, I discovered in the papers of Louis Jolyon West, who was one of the experts, who also had been a prominent, had worked extensively for the CIA and MK Ultra. While he was on the stand testifying that Miss Hearst had been brainwashed, he was asked, could you define brainwashing for me, by the judge? And this was the heart of their defense of Hearst. And he said, no, you can't really define it. It's just not a very good term. It means many things to many people. And then he sort of started to drift off and talk about other scientific processes. So I guess you could argue, and I do argue, that he didn't make a strong case in defending her. But the word itself is legitimately confusing, I think. So.
Now, when we think about mind control in America, we think about spy espionage and everything else, and a lot of people probably think about the CIA and MK Ultra, which inspired the Netflix show Stranger Things. But you write about the lesser-known Violence Center in Los Angeles. Could you tell us more about that?
So yeah, the Violence Center was, it was another project of Louis Jolyon West, who seemed to have a finger in many research endeavors. And he started this program and gained extensive funding at UCLA, which was his job after he moved from Oklahoma, where he had set up a laboratory for MK Ultra. So his next job was at UCLA, and he said his career crowning project would be the creation of a center to study violence in all of its forms. And it was well known that he was interested in sort of how violence could be kind of created as a push-button phenomenon, because he had famously given LSD to an elephant at the Oklahoma Zoo in search of this trigger mechanism that he thought perhaps LSD would be for an elephant, but instead it turned out he just killed the elephant. By the time he got to UCLA, he had this much more capacious program, and it had 34 sub-projects. It would have many researchers studying violence in all of its forms, from prisoners to, they would be targeting hyperkinetic youth, which was a word for ADHD. But anyway, when this was leaked to the press, it didn't go over very well, and it ended up getting the funding removed because it caused kind of a scandal, the approaches to violence that he was arguing for.
You make some insights in the book as well on the relationship to our own emotions has altered because of social media. How has the like, or how has our engagement affected us?
Well, I argue in the book that, I'm trying to actually ask this question also for myself. How are we all affected by the environments we find ourselves in? And brainwashing is it's almost like a laboratory for looking at how people, how the environment and the milieu and the control of information can affect your psychological state or kind of engineer emotional conditions. And so with social media, I think even though we're feeling that our decisions every day in the tiny micro decisions we make to click on something or to like something or to respond seem trivial. They seem extremely trivial, yet I link this to these past episodes of more extreme transformation and argue that what they have in common is a kind of destabilization or ungrounding effect, which is a series of shocks to the point of disorientation, and that we can recognize that sometimes when we're immersed in social media, just the sense of being disembodied, of being in these feedback loops that are triggering emotional responses and then feeding back into the devices.
The posting of misinformation, is there a connection there to mind control and brainwashing as well? On social media, that is.
I think yes, in the sense that if misinformation, and I argue that it does, I think we sometimes make the mistake of thinking that it's a rational or reasonable error that is made in absorbing something, perhaps even a conspiracy theory, but it's actually, I argue that it's more operating on the level of emotion initially, and then we assimilate it as if we'd made a rational choice.
And what do you hope readers, what do you want them to learn from the book?
I guess one of the lessons that I've learned from it myself is that it's easy to believe that brainwashing or mind control or these kind of bizarre things like getting caught up in a cult happens only to other people, but I try to use it more as a lens for self-examination and say that I feel that we're all in it to some degree, or that it's most useful in looking at it that way as a kind of a way to examine our circumstances.
Thank you, Rebecca. Now let's talk about zombie bugs. But before we talk about zombie bugs, I just want to remind folks that you'll have an opportunity to ask them questions. My colleagues will be walking around with index cards and pencils. Just feel free to write on them and raise your hand, and we'll make sure those questions are asked to our two panelists. So, Mindy, we're just going to assume no one in this room knows what a zombie bug is. I hear zombies, I think of The Walking Dead or Pedro Pascal in The Last of Us. What are zombie bugs?
Well, if you know about The Last of Us, you probably know more about zombie bugs than you think, because that was actually based on an actual relationship in nature between a zombifying fungus and ants.
Very scaring me.
Well, so a zombie bug. So when we talk about zombies in the natural world, we're talking about something, a situation where an organism's behavior is being manipulated by a parasite in a way that benefits only the parasite. So obviously there are many types of parasitic relationships where there may be behavioral changes, but they don't necessarily just benefit the parasite. In the case of behavior manipulation, the zombified bug is being manipulated in a way so that it's behaving in a way that it normally wouldn't, in a way that ultimately benefits only the parasite.
What got you interested in this subject matter?
What's not to like about it? So I guess, before I became a science writer, I was a filmmaker, and I was always very, very interested in films that could be made quickly and cheaply, and of course many of those are zombie films. Those are very easy to make cheaply, and so horror and zombies was something that I was always interested in, even before I became interested in writing about science. And so imagine my surprise when I learned during a research project that there are actually real zombies in the natural world, where a parasitic, some sort of parasitic organism takes control of their behavior and makes them do things they wouldn't normally do, and often changes their bodies in pretty disturbing and horrifying ways. So that was something that I got a little bit of taste of in one research project, which was the first time I learned about the relationship between the zombifying fungus Ophiocordyceps and the ants that they zombify. And then I had the opportunity to write about some other types of relationships. There's also a fungus that zombifies periodical cicadas. I don't know if any of you have followed the periodical cicada emergences over the last few years. There's one that is coming up this year, Brood 14. There is a fungus that specifically targets only the periodical cicadas, so only the ones that come out on the 13 or the 17-year cycle. And essentially what it does is it infects them, and in the later stages of infection, it multiplies in their body to the point where the rear third of their abdomen falls off and is replaced by a plug of fungal spores. And then the fungus, what the fungus also does is it produces this compound called cathinone, which is a type of amphetamine that is thought to be related to hypersexualized behavior. So essentially you have these zombified cicadas with spore plugs where their butts used to be, who are trying to mate with males, females. The males actually, they produce this clicking sound that usually only the females produce to try and get males to come and mate with them. And this, of course, helps the fungus to continue its reproductive cycle. And then once I started going even deeper into this, there were just so many examples of this type of strategy. And all of these different types of organisms, from fungi to flies to wasps to worms, that have evolved in many cases over tens of millions of years to have this unique relationship with their hosts, where they can tweak their neurochemistry so specifically to get them to do these really unusual things.
Wow. One of the lessons of your book is that this kind of phenomenon takes place more frequently than that most of us think. During your research, you did come to admire any insect. Did you come to admire any insect more than another for how fascinating or how weird it is?
I come to admire him. I have to say the strategy of the worm Leucochloridium is especially.
Say that again.
Leucochloridium. It's a type of worm, and it infects. Well, it reproduces in birds, but along the way it infects snails. So snails are the host that it uses to get to birds where it needs to be to reproduce. You might ask, how does a worm get from a snail to a bird? Well, what this particular worm does is, in an infected snail, it creates these brood sacs. So these, like these little sausage cylinders that are full of squirming larvae, and the brood sacs migrate into the snail's eye stalks, and they pulsate there. And there's video of this on YouTube. It's absolutely mesmerizing to watch, and it looks very much like the undulation of caterpillars. So what these worms also do is they also appear to change snail behavior to the point where they make the snails go out into the open and wander in exposed areas where they don't normally go to make them more visible. So you have these snails that, instead of hunkering down under the leaves, they're crawling out into the open. They've got these pulsating eye stalks that birds are very attracted to. And what scientists found in experiments is that the eye stalks detach very easily. So birds can very easily snap one of them off, swallow it, and then the worm is where it needs to be to reproduce inside the guts of the bird.
Wow. Now, this wouldn't be a good event about science if you don't tell us what happens to a spider after a wasp larva starts building its cocoon inside the spider's abdomen.
Well, there are a couple of really good examples of spiders and different ways that they're zombified. This one is, I believe, a type of wasp that what it actually does is the wasp lays an egg that it glues to the spider's body. So the egg hatches, and then this wasp larva essentially piggybacks on the spider for a while. Sort of sipping its hemolymph, kind of treating it like a living juice box. And once it gets to the point where it's ready to pupate, that's where it actually actively starts manipulating the behavior of the spider. And what it appears to do is rewire the way the spider makes its web. So instead of an orb weaver spider is known for making this, very, very distinctive type of web that has these spokes that radiate out from the center, and then there are these spirals that go around it. An infected spider, however, at the point where where the wasp larva is ready to pupate, it does not make that kind of web. What it does is it instead builds something that resembles more of a molting web, so where the radii are reinforced and there's no spiral. Then, of course, what happens is the larvae essentially drains the spider dry, the dead spider drops to the ground, and then the larvae builds its cocoon, not on the spider, but in the web. So it has the spider as its last act build this web which is optimized to support the cocoon, and then it's safely able to pupate there.
And what kind of real-world benefits do we gain from studying zombie bugs?
Well, there is a lot to learn about the specifics of neurochemistry and behavior. Behavior is something that is so complex, and there are so many different factors that influence behavior and that shape behavior. And so looking at the scope of all of these different types of zombifiers and the different processes that they have, the different strategies that they have, just creates a much more complete picture of how neurochemistry works and how brains work and how behavior works. So even if there is not a direct parallel, so no, you do not need to worry about it, any of these zombifiers that target arthropods, you are safe from them. They are not likely to mutate or evolve to the point where they can manipulate humans, but there is still a lot to be learned there about how brains and behavior work.
I'm going to ask both of you now how you got interested in turn these fascinating subject matters into these wonderful books. Again, right before I do that, if you have a question for them, just raise your hand, and Rob and Danielle will be going up and down the aisles to give you guys some index cards. So Rebecca, let's talk about how when you told us how you got very fascinated with it, but how did you turn that idea to this, and all the work that had to be done to create this?
Well, I had been teaching about this topic for a number of years and I just decided I should finally write a book about it, because as I taught over the years, I started to realize that at first I think I treated it as a one-dimensional phenomenon or sort of a freakish thing, brainwashing, but as I learned more about the stories of individuals to whom this happened, that they were, 17-year-old kids who had signed up to fight in Korea, and just the sheer details of what happened to them, the mundane parts of it, it kind of came alive to me, and I thought maybe I could find a way to link those stories just really through people's personal experiences. What is it like to be in a cult? What is it like? There's a classic line in the research about brainwashing from Cardinal Mindszenty, who was an early experiencer of this by the Hungarian and Soviet police. He said, at the end of this, he was held prisoner for 23 days. He had been this war hero, and he was arrested by this secret police and held, and he underwent humiliation. He had to crawl around on the ground wearing a clown costume even to eat, and he had been this highly honored man. And after only 23 days, he was possibly drugged. He was beaten occasionally, but it really wasn't about brutality. It wasn't really about torture. It was about this kind of upending of his life circumstances, that at the end, he was brought before the cameras, the newsreel cameras, and he confessed to terrible things that it seemed obvious he hadn't done, like he had stolen crown jewels, and he had blasphemed the church. And he said later, and people looked at him and they said, this is a zombie. He doesn't look like himself. And it was as if the leadership was parading him to show what they could do to somebody. And he said later, when he wrote his memoir in the 70s, he said, without knowing what had happened to me, I had become a different person. And I thought that would be interesting if I could actually write a book that took you step by step through what it would mean to be a different person and whether that lasts. Because one of my findings is that it is possible to be what you could call brainwashed, but it's not necessarily lasting. And one of the mistakes they made was, including the CIA, was to assume that this would be a permanent transformation.
Mindy, like when you were doing your research, when did you think like, aha, this could be a book?
I think it was when I started to put together the pieces of not just these individual examples of zombifiers and zombified invertebrates, but also just looking at the fascination that people have with zombies in pop culture. And this is something that has been enduring for decades, but it does seem like zombies are having a bit of a moment right now. And with the success of The Last of Us, of The Walking Dead before that, but also like there's a Disney series of zombie movies, and I think Marvel has a series of like Marvel superheroes that are zombies, and I could go on and on about that, but yeah, so that was something that made me think about what not just what is the science behind zombification and what does it mean when we talk about zombie bugs, but what do zombies teach us about us? Why are we interested in zombies? Why are we fascinated by zombies? And what do we learn about ourselves by looking at zombies? And so this book was an opportunity for me to take a look at the sort of bigger picture of that and try and put those pieces together too. And one example of that, which is interesting, I found, which was something I didn't know about when I started researching the book, was that there was actually a CDC campaign, Zombies 101 kind of campaign, where they used zombies as a communication tool, a science communication tool for teaching about infectious disease and how pandemics and how diseases spread. And they put a lot of effort into this. They had posters, they had comic books, and then I think a few years later they partnered with another. They partnered with a movie studio and kind of brought it back again. So the idea that the CDC would turn to this as a tool for teaching something about pandemics was just another part of how zombies and zombification is something that can speak to these bigger issues.
One thing about writing science nonfiction, you could keep on researching. Like you keep on going. I mean, working at a library here, we love that. When do you make the decision, I need how do you navigate research and actually, going to your laptop and start writing? I'll start with you, Rebecca.
How do you navigate the starting part or the ending part? Because
both.
Maybe it's both, yeah. Well, I like to start while I'm researching because I think it's very, and I highly recommend this, I think it sometimes can stop you from writing if you think, I just have to finish that last piece of research, because I'm still actually researching. But so to be doing some writing while you're researching can kind of create you're just doing different tasks and you can think through the material a bit while you're researching it, but also there's the question of when do you know that you're at the end? And in my case, it has a single word answer, which is when I got to psychedelics, which was going to be the last chapter of the book, where I was going to explore whether people who, the new renaissance of psychedelics has shown that it creates highly suggestible states, and there are certain cases of abuse, but also this great promise in the new research, and I thought I would write a last chapter. But I just found that took the book too far, so I thought I'll do that in a future project.
And your subject matter is a bit visual too. Like, when did you know that you had to, put thought to paper?
I probably could have kept researching for another couple of years, but at a certain point you have to stop and actually start writing. I needed to have a sense going in of what the arc was going to be and where it was going to end as well. And for me, I knew that because I was already thinking about these bigger topics, I knew that was pretty much where everything was going to kind of come together was looking at, okay, well, what does all this mean for us? And so so even as I was researching, I knew that was ultimately where it was going to end. The tricky part was that there were just so many great examples, and I could only fit so many in the book. So yeah, again, it was for me too. It was also the process was very much about, as I was doing the researching, I was sorting and organizing at the same time. So not so much writing any of the chapters per se, but figuring out how I was going to group all of these different examples of zombification together, because there are zombifying fungi, there are zombifying worms, there are zombifying flies and wasps and bacteria and viruses, and so thinking about that as I went. So as I was coming across all these examples, figuring out how they were going to be grouped, what was the best way to kind of not just tell these individual stories of how these different zombifiers work and the kind of mechanisms that they use, and also just the ways that they change host behavior, but also looking at how is this going to build towards the final conclusion of this tells a bigger story, and this is something that's about us too.
Speaking of research, we're here at the Library of Congress. We're a big advocate clearly for primary sources and the value of what our librarians and curators do, and museum curators as well. Where did you go for your research, and how did that spark, of going to other institutions as well?
Well, I just realized this. I've been researching this topic for about 2 decades or so, because it goes back to my dissertation. But I started going to these papers at UCLA at their Manuscripts and Archives Library, which is a wonderful place. And they have the papers of Louis Jolyon West, who was the CIA researcher I mentioned. And when they had just opened the papers, I went there and I brought my daughter, who was then about 6 or so. And of course, I didn't bring her into these papers, but she would hang out with her grandmother. And I was just realizing she kind of grew over the years I've been back, over about 15 years. And she's grown up alongside the archives. And I just have this very strong, this is just one of many places I've done, but it's one that I've gone back to again and again, because he seemed to keep every single piece of paper he ever, except for maybe the highly classified ones. But just going back, I learned something every time. And the last time I went back, my daughter actually came with me and helped. She's a college-age student now, and she helped me do some of the research. And it was just this wonderful sense of the project itself growing up too with my life. So I'm a big fan of original sources and archives.
Bill Gates wrote in his recent memoir that what he likes about going to the library is it's like a treasure hunt of discovering books and discovering ideas. How is that for you, Mindy, of discovering more about zombie bugs and other insects?
Well, for me, most of the papers, the journals that I read for this during my research stage, most of those I accessed online. I did not actually go to a library for them. However, I did go to a couple of. I did go to the mycology collection at the New York Botanic Gardens, which was absolutely incredible, because I was able there to see some examples of insects that had been parasitized by different types of fungi that had been collected, in some cases going back a century or more. And what was actually really amazing to me, which I don't know why this didn't occur to me before I saw them, is how tiny they are. And I guess when you think about, when you see photos of any kind of zombie bug, it looks much, much bigger than it actually is. And, and then of course, if you think about the ways that zombified humans are, the prosthetics that are based on actual types of zombification in nature, they're at a much larger scale. But when you're talking about an ant that has been parasitized by Ophiocordyceps, it is something that you can balance on the tip of your fingernail. And being able to actually see these up close, see them firsthand, was just an amazing thing.
Is that open to the public? And of course, all of us are like, oh, where is this again?
This is it. The New York Botanic Garden Mycology Collection.
And they let the public see it?
I know that it's actually
researchers.
Yeah, yes, it was under the auspices of research. And I also went to the University of Utrecht to meet with a researcher there and see some of the samples in her collection, also of Ophiucordyceps. And yeah, so just being able to, even though that was just one example of one of the zombifier relationships that I mentioned in the book, just being able to see that and was really something.
Wonderful. All right. We want to hear from everyone here now. I'm going to invite Clay Smith, my wonderful colleague, who's the literary director for the library. And many of you, if you have questions for Rebecca and Mindy, please just raise your hand again and ask, and Rob and Danielle will come down with some index cards. But I think Clay has some already.
Yeah, we've got some great questions. Okay, so this first one is for Rebecca. Do you find a distinction in cases when individuals are willing participants in their own brainwashing versus being victims of it? I'm thinking of the recent Netflix series Adolescence, where a young boy was, one might say, brainwashed into incel culture by voluntarily engaging with those social media platforms. How do we cast responsibility for brainwashing?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's insight already in the question. And it's actually what drew me to the topic. I think one of the best synonyms for brainwashing or phrases that encapsulates what's interesting about it is the phrase coercive persuasion. So it's not simply pure torture or pure coercion or pure force, though there is that, there has to be that, but it's persuasive at the same time. So there's always, I would say, some element of buy-in even if it's just, as in the case of Patty Hearst or other prisoners of war, I decided I wanted to survive. And people even blamed her for that. Like, it would have been better, perhaps they make that decision for her. But she said, every minute I decided to stay alive, I became more enthusiastic. She basically said I had to become what they wanted me to. But it was being put at that choice point. So I think there are, examples. I haven't seen Adolescent yet, but I think that what's interesting about cults too is people enter them willingly, but they're often misinformed or even deliberately deceived about the nature of the organization. And as it unfolds, they have participated to some degree or concurred. So this is really a tricky area, and it's not always clear, and it can be different for each person as well. And so I think that's part of what requires discernment. It also is a warning not to simply assume. I would hear a story of a scam, some clever scam or a cult that's, led by a leader who seems distinctly uncharismatic to me, and we like to think I would never fall for that. Or at this point, I never would have believed that he was the smartest man in the world or something like that. But actually, it's trying to understand that it's a result of the conditions in which someone finds themselves, and that we all are, subject to conditions at different times, sometimes accidentally or.
Yeah. Okay, next question is for Mindy. It's a little spooky. In your research, did you come across the likeliness of parasitizing fungus in humans as climate change is causing emerging infectious diseases?
This is actually also something that was alluded to in the first season of The Last of Us. There was a flashback scene where they had a couple of scientific experts who were speaking to that. And the short answer is no, there is really no imminent danger of zombifying fungi evolving to infect humans, despite climate change. Now that's not to say that climate change is not having an impact on where fungi can live and what their ranges can be, because that is definitely something that is happening. But the specific relationship between a fungus that can tweak the neurochemistry of an ant, for example, so specifically to get the ant to do something that is so atypical for an ant, to leave the colony, to wander away from the colony, to climb a stem and bite down on a leaf and then die there. That is something that is the result of millions of years of evolution. And the idea that a fungus could be able to evolve, mutate in some way to be able to make that shift to manipulate a human brain is something that is kind of beyond the realm of possibility. And that's beside the fact that the reason why fungi, parasitic fungi, do not generally do well in the human body is because of our body temperatures. That is something that, even though there are some types of fungi that obviously are part of our microbiome and that can infect people, the specific type of zombifying fungi that affect ants, that's not really within the realm of possibility.
But I'm still going to put my AC down really cold tonight. Just like, don't want this parasitizing fungi to be anywhere near. So we had a few sort of real-world questions for Rebecca. If you believe someone to be brainwashed or in the process of being brainwashed, how can you support them? Are there signs to look for, and how can you undo brainwashing?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think people, so in the early, in the days when cults were first kind of entering the consciousness of parents and families in the US in the 60s and 70s, there was a whole group of deprogrammers, even a new profession that was born, deprogramming, which involved, and this is kind of it's a tale with some lessons. It was invented by a man named Ted Patrick, and it involved simply kidnapping with the family's consent. So say a parent would say, I would like you to kidnap my child from this, from whatever group it was. They were Children of God or something. This was a common group that would just lure young people into their vans and buses, and then they would end up devoting their lives to it. So they would anyway, this young person would be really forcefully kidnapped, dragged away and locked in a windowless basement, sometimes tied to a chair for 48 hours while it was actually really the same process of, they were interrogated, they were, in a sense forced to renege on their ideas and embrace their previous ideas. But I don't think that whenever they were released, they would often go right back because they hadn't agreed to the process. So sometimes it would take hold and sometimes it wouldn't. And another problem was the deprogrammers were put in prison. They were convicted of kidnapping in a couple of cases. So they rethought of their position as exit counselors. And I do recommend, if you do have a family member in what seems to be an abusive cult, there is no absolute list of what is abusive and what is not for several reasons. But if you do have someone that appears to be in such a situation, you can consult with an exit counselor. There are people who have many years of experience in therapy, and if the person is willing to talk to a therapist, they can often be very skilled, but there really has to be some break. Often in stories of people who get out of cults or of abusive, even coercive, controlling relationships, which can mimic a cult, like an abusive relationship can be like a cult of one. There has to often be a shattering moment or just a rupture of that control that allows the person to be open to receiving information, because it's kind of unfortunately, if the person isn't ready to leave, they often won't.
Yeah. So Mindy, what benefit do zombie bugs bring? What would we lose if they went extinct?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
What would we lose if zombie bugs went extinct?
If zombie bugs went extinct? Well, in some cases, zombie bugs have actually been used for pest control. And so the example of the phorid flies, which are known as the ant decapitating flies. So this is a genus of very, very tiny flies that many of which are known for zombifying fire ants in their native South America. And one of the things that is interesting about that is when these flies show up, they completely disrupt the behavior of fire ants. So what the ants do when they actually when they actually zombify the ants is they again they get them to they get them to leave their colonies. The larvae, sorry, I'm going to back up a little bit. So the flies, they lay their eggs in the ants. The larvae, within pretty soon after hatching, it migrates into the ant's head, and it starts to grow there. And then when it's ready to pupate, it manipulates the ants so that it leaves the colony, and it releases compounds that essentially weaken the connections in the ant's exoskeleton. So the ant's head falls off, and then the fly pupates inside the head, basically using the head like a cocoon. It extends a couple little breathing tubes outside so it can breathe, but it is essentially kept safe inside the ant's head. Now, when these flies show up outside a group of fire ants, the ants, it completely disrupts their behavior. It changes their foraging habits. They take different routes for foraging. They send out different types of workers. So it essentially throws the colony into disarray in a way that it is thought keeps the fire ants from overrunning their ecosystem, because it opens pathways for other ant species to move in. So invasive fire ants in North America have been extremely problematic, have been able to establish themselves in ways that make them very problematic for the ecosystems that they're in. And forward flies are thought to be one possible pathway to controlling and containing them.
Can you name me a really happy book to read before I go to bed tonight so I forget everything?
Frog and Toad Together is a really nice counterbalance to all this.
Okay, for Rebecca, I would like to ask whether you cover the activities of corporations who, in my view, are constantly trying to create a favorable public perception of themselves. Do you have examples of corporate campaigns that would qualify as brainwashing?
That I don't in the book. I think in the history of advertising, I think, so the history of advertising does cross over with the history of brainwashing and fascination with whether corporations are using nefarious techniques to speak to us. Like there's the subliminal suggestions in the 70s, which were a real technique, were kind of a focus of that fear that corporations had, these powers. I guess really advertising does partake of some of the same circumstances as brainwashing. And even if you think about the way that malls are designed to create sonic and smell, used to basically speak to all of your senses, to invite you in certain ways, to promise a transformed life. The smell of French fries, or these kind of the density of messages that a modern shopping environment can create, and the sophistication of their marketing through. I think when my daughter was young, I was really struck by Pottery Barn. I'm not saying they're brainwashing people, but just that these are highly immersive environments, and they really do sculpt one's expectations of what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a girl. There are different parts of the store, and the way that I think they do have some similarities. But I didn't research this specifically, though I think it would be worth looking into further.
And so, Mindy, we've got a question about spores. You mentioned the spores strategy. How is that strategy developed by the spores? Is it trial and error over time?
I'm guessing. So this is the spores, the Ophiocordyceps spores. Mm-hmm. So the thinking is that when spores are picked up by an insect, say on the forest floor, that there are chemical cues that alert the fungal spores to know that they are in contact with a species that they will be able to successfully infect and manipulate. So that's the thinking, and then once apparently once that connection is made, then the spore penetrates through the exoskeleton and starts to multiply and form fungal threads called mycelium and insinuate itself into the insect's body physically, and also then either release compounds or trigger the release of compounds within the insect itself. So it's interesting because that's the idea that the spore somehow knows when it's hitchhiking on the right host is something that the details of that are something that scientists are still working out, but that is the reigning hypothesis. And there's a question actually related to that for the relationship between the fungus Mesospora and the periodical cicadas, because scientists still aren't quite sure. That now this is a cicada that has a 13 or 17-year life cycle, right? So one of the open questions for that is, when do they get infected? So are they getting, because the last thing that the cicadas do before they die is they lay their eggs, the eggs hatch, the nymphs fall to the ground, they burrow into the ground, they stay there for 13 or 17 years. Is that when they're getting infected? Is the fungus infecting them then and then just kind of staying dormant in them for the next 13 years until they come to the surface? Or are they getting infected on the way up? And so the thinking is that there is probably the same type of chemical cue involved, where that's how the fungus knows that it's attached itself to to a host where it's going to be able to eventually germinate. But when exactly that happens is something that scientists are still looking to figure out.
Yeah. I think we've got time for one more question for each of you. So Rebecca, do you have thoughts about how brainwashing influences today's political climate? Can you call that brainwashing? Does brainwashing happen in a large societal context?
I think yes. I would say that, and there are books that explore this, with specific political groups, but I personally find it, when it operates as an insult or a way to exile huge portions of society, I haven't found it as useful. Not to say that people can't do those analyses and have legitimate points to make. I just find it useful as something that we all are participating in. So I find it actually incredibly common. I mean, just to the extent that politics has diffused into the social media environments, and they become just parts of almost like emotional calling cards, and they're disseminated in that way, and in ways that are arguably quite new, although they have links to the past. So I think those dynamics are what are interesting to look at, and I try to trace that in the book, or give myself, and that's one reason I wrote myself into the book as well. I talk about my own experiences, being just feeling that your opinion has been changed without quite knowing it, and participating in certain ways. Just examining that process that I think we're all a party to.
And Mindy, we've got a question for you about the difference between communicating science on video versus in a book. How are those two different forms different for you?
The rule about video in general is show, don't tell. Right? So in video, images are doing most of the heavy lifting. I mean, there are many different aspects to storytelling, but in video you can rely much more on showing something. And which actually, when you're talking about talking about zombie bugs, there is a lot of very visual stuff there, and it is very compelling. And it was actually that was a bit of a challenge for me as I was writing this book. Was thinking about, okay, I want people to be able to see this. I want this to be as cinematic as possible. So, in addition to describing the science and describing the pathways of zombification, I also wanted to present as clear a picture as I could of some of the different forms that zombification takes, and how manipulation happens, and how these insects' brains, bodies, and behavior are being changed.
Yeah. So we didn't get to all the questions. You had some great questions. Don't forget to participate in the real world hands-on experiments that our really cool preservation department is doing on the second floor, the mezzanine. The book signing is a perfect chance to ask more questions and talk to our writers. It's happening in Whitall Pavilion, just when you leave this auditorium, just to the left. So we encourage you to go and meet our writers there, and let's thank them for being here, and Roswell for moderating.
Thank you.